So, moving down to project cost management, ask ourselves the question, does it make sense to do cost estimating here? Have at the back of your mind that before you get to project cost management, you would have had a high level idea or a rough idea, maybe from a previous project, on how much the project will actually cost you. So when you get into project cost management, you're not getting there without any information whatsoever. You are getting there with some information. Where's that information coming from? You ask yourself, on this project, is it just the project management team working on the project, or do we have vendors from outside? If you do have vendors from outside, guess what? Your planned purchases and acquisitions needs to be happening at the same time or even before you do project cost management. So even though you've got procurement all the way down here showing as, in quote, the last knowledge area that you perform, you're actually relying on certain outputs from processes that fall below project time management and project cost management to do those activities which appear to be, in quote, higher up. So you plan your purchases and acquisitions, you plan your contracting, request seller responses, select sellers. At the point you're selecting your sellers and you've got the contract and you've looked at the costs, those are pieces that will be inputs to project cost management. So in a situation whereby you've got vendors working with you on the contract or on the project, you actually need to think about cost before you get to, in quote, the project cost management knowledge area. And that's why in the PMBOK guide we've got various maps shown across chapter 3 that indicate that project management is an integrative, iterative process, and it doesn't have to do with doing things in isolation. Project time management can't be done in a vacuum, neither can project cost management, neither can project quality management, because all these things impact each other. You've probably heard of the triple constraint, now popularly known as the quadruple constraint, or people even call it the quintuple constraint. What are the things that would affect your project? Nowadays, people even throw in uncertainty, risk. That's been another thing. So there are various things that could impact your project, but what I'm driving at is trying to get you to realize that you cannot perform all these processes in isolation. You have several feedback loops and overlaps in project management. Let's talk about quality. Quality has to be planned in, we know that. At what point do you plan in your quality? If you plan in quality at the beginning of the project, then you'll have a rough idea of how much it would cost you to implement those quality standards. You'll also have an idea of the resources that you would need to implement those quality standards. The resources that would implement the quality standards are also part of the human resource management discussion, because you need those quality experts when you're acquiring the project team. So we talk about quality assurance, we talk about acquiring the project team, and those seem to be downstream, but indeed they might be happening at the same time that activity resource estimating and activity duration estimating is happening. Based on the quality standards, how long is it going to take us to complete this project? Perhaps if there were no quality standards, we could get this project done in a lot less time. So there are different things you need to be thinking about. Another key point to think about when working on your project schedule is risk. Perhaps it's going to be like a project I worked on that snowed in Arizona 12 inches up in Flagstaff when we weren't even expecting it. In that regard, risk needs to be considered at the beginning of a project. What's the probability that this event can occur, and if it does occur, what is the impact going to be on the project? And if that's going to be the impact, what's our workaround? And if this is our workaround, then what is our budget going to be like for this risk? Well, the good thing is we had a risk mitigation strategy, but it was rather weak. At the end of the day, it was very catastrophic. in that we didn't get work done for several weeks because it just kept snowing. So in situations such as that, you needed to have been planning risk earlier rather than leave it till later on in the project. And that's really what I'm driving at. Risk planning needs to be done early in the project. It needs to be done at the same time you're thinking about cost. Quality needs to be considered at the same time you're thinking about schedule and scope, because indeed, the scope of quality is part of scope. So if you really want to implement quality the way the client wants, it needs to be part of the scope. And that will also be part of scope verification, because if the quality standards were not implemented in the deliverable, then of course it's going to be rejected at scope verification. So when you are studying for the PMP exam, do not think that all the processes that fall below, like the ones below time and cost, indeed are happening after. Those processes could very well be happening at the same time as any of those other processes up above. And I call it the project time management line, because we're very fond of saying, well, all these things need to happen first before anything else. And as you can see, that's not true. So we've looked at project procurement management needing to happen early to get those estimates. And even that funnels part of the human resource management discussion, because in your project procurement management, you might be using the onesie twosie contractors, and you might need to actually have contracts with them for that work. It might be a totally new contract, and those are part of the contracts that you would be administering. But you would also be talking about that up there in human resource planning when you're acquiring the project team. And then you have the bigger corporations that are partners, and in that regard you need to be thinking about cost estimating and cost budgeting. And then you also have risk and quality as being key areas you need to think about before you even talk about how much your final budget is going to be. So that's all for planning, and then going into executing. Executing is absolutely iterative, integrative, could be happening at the same time. You acquire your project team and develop your project team, obviously. But you do not perform quality assurance before you acquire your project team. So this flaws the idea that you need to memorize things in order, because if you say, well, I need to direct and manage project execution and perform quality assurance before I acquire a project team, it doesn't make sense. You acquire your project team and you develop them as the project goes along, but then you perform quality assurance. Those are the people who are going to be performing quality assurance along with you, the project manager. And then information distribution, it happens throughout the project. It could happen at the beginning, it could happen all the way to the end. There are lots of times in planning that stakeholders are already working fervently on adding scope or killing scope. So you will need to have that interaction as far as communication is concerned with your stakeholders, and it might even be upfront there in planning in reality. And then you've got request seller responses and select sellers as being activities that show below the project time management line. So in the project, when you get to information distribution, if you were really memorizing the processes in this hierarchy, it wouldn't make sense to say we are requesting seller responses after information distribution. It wouldn't make sense. And then going over to monitoring and controlling, scope verification, as we know, is accepting the deliverable and verifying that the work is complete. Are we saying that scope verification happens before schedule control and cost control and perform quality control? Scope verification is the last thing that happens as far as the deliverable being handed off. In scope control, you're still working on the deliverable. Schedule control, you're still working on it, and cost control. So memorizing the order of processes does not make sense. What makes sense is memorizing or understanding the processes that occur in each knowledge area.